All right. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for signing up and being here, supporting our diversity speaker series event, and also just a combination with our virtual art showcase. So I'm just gonna share a PowerPoint really quick. Pretty much the outline for tonight. We were gonna just do a brief introduction about BSA, talk about some recent things we've done, but then also take some time to go over and discuss our art showcase. I'm hoping everyone saw advertisement about that, and are planning to go onto our auction site and participate. Just give a little background on that, and then we will shift gears and then allow Dr. Lodge time to present with us tonight. Oh yes, thank you, Marlon. The link to the auction site is in the chat as well. Oh, Shania, you got to give me permission to share now.
Okay, 1 second. Um, you should be good now.
Yep. Can everybody see that? Okay. Awesome. All right. Yes. So again, thank you for being here and welcome to our diversity speakers event slash virtual art showcase. Um, so, so as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, BSA touch base just to work on some of our programming for the year, and really wanted to highlight um, artists and artwork surrounding Black wellness and a vision of Blackness, leading to our 2024 art showcase. So in honor of Juneteenth, BSA put together a statement that we'd like to share. At a time in history when there is a desire to rewrite, in some cases erase, Black history, it is crucial to recognize the freedom of our ancestors. To understand a partial weight lifted off their backs on June 19th, 1865, 2.5 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, our ancestors began their most significant challenge of freedom, equity, and equality, a fight that we continue even today. So again, that's something we want to share with all of you, and we publicize that in some of our advertisements as well, just to support your reflection and honor of Juneteenth. Just a little bit about BSA. So we made these lovely infographics just to highlight some of BSA's former members and current executive board members and our faculty advisors. So Brianna, who is our president, myself, Nathan Smith, is the vice president of BSA. And then tonight we also have Shania here, who's the treasurer, special events coordinator, also assists with many other roles as part of BSA. Sheila, who's also here tonight, and she's BSA secretary, but also works and supports various roles. And then Donica Harper, she was our 2022, 2024 president, maybe a couple more years than that, but she's really involved in BSA and getting things going. And then Dr. Talia Bragg, who was our inaugural president from 2017 to 2022. And of course, we have some of our amazing BSA faculty advisors. Dr. Adrian Green, who is here with us tonight. Also, Dr. Davis White-Eyes, Dr. Page, Dr. Harris-Britt, Dr. Williams, and Dr. Jackson. Just to highlight a couple of BSA accomplishments. So we developed the Dr. Stephen Ruffin's Memorial Scholarship. We maintained COVID 19 roundtables, which hence the name, started around the peak of the pandemic, which was developed for a space for Black students to be able to have community touch base virtually so that we can be able to process the events that are going on, but also maintain this sense of connectedness. So we maintain those, and we have on-campus meetings that are available for Black students, but then also allies as well. We also had BSA graduation stoles, our diversity speaker series, which is something that we are very proud of and continue to offer the fielding community. BSA fundraisers, which the art showcase being one, to continue to support events like this, our diversity speaker series. And then also we have BSA merchandise, which we can drop that in the chat as well, where we have various like BSA shirts and other items that are available for purchase. Ultimately, to support BSA's efforts and continuing to everything that we're offering to support Black students, faculty, and the larger fielding community. Okay, so our auction. So we just wanted to give a brief overview of the purpose and then actually show you guys some of the amazing artwork that was submitted for the auction. But we were able to extend the deadline. So originally the deadline was going to be ending tonight, but we got some feedback and we wanted to extend it another week. So now the deadline is until next Monday by 11:59 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And the link is in the chat. If you just joined, we can re-add the link as well. Or if you have any questions, we can resend the link out if you're not a part of the fielding community and getting the link that way. Okay, so about the art showcase, briefly, some of the things I mentioned before, just to support the BSA and the efforts that we bring forth for Black students in the larger fielding community and diversity speaker series and other events. But the theme of this particular showcase around art pieces presented in the auction are inspiring, unique, and reflect the theme of anti-Black racism. Black Lives Matter, Black is Beautiful, and Black are Proud, for example. It's a fundraiser to support the Black Student Association, and which supports, again, events like the Diversity Speaker Series and the annual MLK celebration. And then also, it's important to highlight that we really wanted to celebrate the artists who took the time out of their schedule, many of whom are very busy, supporting others, taking care of their daily lives. Many who might be primary caregivers for family members or others, but took time out of their busy schedules to still donate something to BSA in this cause. So we really wanted to not only find ways to support BSA, but also to celebrate these artists and the effort and time that they put in. So again, we really appreciate everyone's taking time out. We are exploring additional ways for people to bid, but right now there is a set auction site that people can bid on via the link that's provided. Okay, just my screen open. Okay, so one of the first contributions was by Dr. Green, Black Ecology. This is the first piece. It uses the surreal style to depict interconnectivity of all the elements of creation, including humans, animals, plants, air, land, and water. A combination of ecological elements shock the usual visual sensibilities and defy stereotypical images of beauty. However, the beauty of Blackness is transmitted through the spirits of ancestral lineages and expressed as Black ecology. So this is available for bidding. And then a second beautiful art piece as well, submitted by Dr. Green, is also available, and a similar description and dimensions as well. And it's oil on canvas and it will be framed. And also we have a collage that was submitted by Alma Martinez. And it's a vibrant collage which was inspired by the theme Black is Beautiful. It is made of vintage postcards featuring a diverse array of succulents, flowers, moths, and butterflies that frame the face of American novelist and editor Toni Morrison. Sections of the collage are also hand painted to provide texture and depth. Another piece, Shelling Black Eyed Peas by Anita Crawford Clark. And this piece was done with pastels and collage. And then also a piece that was donated by the Atlanta Professional Development Seminar, which is something a part of the fielding community. And a brief description of this particular artwork. When faced with turbulence and unexpected twists in life, the power of an embrace from the significant other can be a source of comfort and healing. The simple act of connection speaks directly to the heart, offering not just solace, but also a tangible reminder that one is not alone in their struggle. An embrace can calm the storm of emotions, providing both emotional support and need for human connection. And this full description is also available on the auction site, but I just wanted to highlight some of the key features. And it's a piece that was originally created by Robert Jackson. The Power of the Afro by myself. And it's black charcoal pencil and charcoal sticks on canvas. Black hair is unique and powerful. The artist celebrates how important black hair is to Black man's identity. The large and full afro and beard symbolize Black pride and the Black man's confidence. Beaded bracelets. So there's several beaded bracelets that are available within this particular submission. And each item is a beaded bracelet with a different pattern. The actual size of the bracelet may vary at completion. For instance, the bracelet with the black fist will actually have 3 fists. And if anything else you would like to know about this, you can certainly reach out to us and we will connect you with the artist. And A Vision of Blackness by Terry Dunham. Red, white, and blue. Black Deaths Matter Too. And then also Evolution AI artwork submitted by Nawal Ahawasi. This artwork created with the assistance of artificial intelligence represents the evolution of hostile women from the origins of hostile to their presence across the diaspora and various Western and Eastern countries. This piece is a tribute to resilience and the perseverance of Black women, celebrating their enduring spirit and cultural legacy as they navigate and influence a diverse global landscape. This visional journey that not only highlights their historicals, but also showcases their impact far beyond the traditional homeland. And this one also has several different images, including one. And then we also have some fashion sketches by Sherry Swaby. And the piece was inspired from the plaid print. The model is Afrocentric and sports a kinky hairdo. She is as bold and feminine as a deep weave of the fabric. We celebrate Black fashion, which was not always accessible to us. And just contact information for BSA, our email bsa@fielding.edu. And again, the auction link will be in the chats, and you can certainly reach out to us with any questions. And again, it's been extended for one more week, and we encourage people and we appreciate any donations. With that, and I'm going to stop sharing.
All right.
And pass it to my colleague Sheila to introduce Dr. Lodge.
Thank you, Nathan. And make sure you all go bid on those pieces. Not just to support BSA, but support the artists' contributions as well. So it affords me great pleasure to introduce to you all our speaker of the hour, Dr. Tania S. Lodge. Dr. Tania S. Lodge is the founder and chief executive officer of Kindred Spirit Behavioral Health, an African-centered behavioral health agency in Akron, Ohio. She is a licensed clinical and forensic psychologist specializing in culturally specific psychological services and assessment, program development and evaluation, and continuing education workshops on cultural competency and African-centered healing approaches. Dr. Lodge is a lead trainer and provides training, supervision, and consultation for the certification for the practice of optimal conceptual theory and belief systems analysis psychotherapy. She is an active member of the Association of Black Psychologists, where she serves on the board of directors and is the project lead and chair for the Sabona Healing Circles National Program. Dr. Lodge received her doctorate degree in clinical psychology with a concentration in forensic psychology from Fielding Graduate University. She holds 2 master's degrees in marriage and family therapy and clinical psychology. Dr. Lodge has approximately 20 years of clinical experience, as well as extensive knowledge and experience developing and evaluating programs. Her clinical and research projects and interests include program evaluation and development, African-centered treatment outcomes, culturally specific assessments, African-centered psychotherapy, process addictions, interpersonal and racial trauma, infant mortality, and psychological oppression. Dr. Lodge has co-authored many peer-reviewed articles and manuscripts on African-centered healing approaches. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tania S. Lodge.
Thank you, Sheila.
Okay, welcome.
And thanks for inviting me to speak about belief systems analysis. So you guys are saying BSA, and it stands for Black Students Association. I'm getting confused. I'm like, that's belief systems analysis. So I'm going to talk to you all about a very specific African-centered approach and theory that I have been studying and training in and training others since my journey into the doctoral program at Fielding Graduate University, which started in 2009. And Dr. A.G. Green was my dissertation chair. So he signed off on this work as I researched it earlier on as I was in the program. So I just wanted to give a shout out to Dr. A.G. because I see he is also present tonight. So it's always good to be back and to be able to talk about the things that we are experiencing collectively, and then some very specific, culturally specific things we can do to address it. So I'm going to start to share my screen, and I am talking about cultural trauma and various forms of racial trauma, because it's so important given the cultural context of what we are all experiencing and have been exposed to in our country. And then I'm going to really talk about the impact that this has on us and what I am not only seeing in my practice, but also in the community at large, and how all of us are impacted by this, and some strategies and things we can do and begin to rely on from an African-centered perspective that will allow us to overcome, to continue to overcome, and just be able to navigate the persistent nature of the traumas that we are experiencing. So I just really appreciate the invitation to come and speak this evening. I do need permission to share my screen. Okay.
Okay, there you go.
Thank you. And so I am going to talk about cultural trauma and how to break the chains of psychological slavery that is the result of persistent cultural trauma. And then it's specifically what that looks like using a very specific theoretical orientation. So that's the premise as to what I'm going to share. And the first thing I want to do, hopefully this works, is to share a short video. And please tell me if you guys can see and hear this. Can you, Sheila or Nathan? You can hear?
Address the trauma.
Okay, I can hear it.
But you can't see it?
Slavery. Can you imagine the depression and exploring?
No, so you might have to, yeah. So a separate window, you might have to like reshare it and share it to YouTube.
Practices. In 400 years of trauma, we look at the impact of racial trauma throughout our history and now, how it is affecting us today.
Yeah.
As civil rights leader Reverend Otis Moss Jr. sits in the chapel of the UH Community and Health Center that bears his name, he reflects on the many layers of racism he's experienced over his lifetime.
Racism is the personification of evil and injustice.
Racial trauma refers to the severe mental and emotional response caused by encounters with racial bias and ethnic discrimination, hate crimes, and the ongoing harmful emotional effects that builds up over time.
There's been research that's happened over the last 20 to 25 years now showing that racism is connected to just about every major mental illness and many physical health conditions. So the more racism you experience, the worse your mental health, the worse your physical health, and for many reasons.
When we experience racism, microaggressions, daily insults, this actually translates into higher stress steroids, higher cortisol, circulating cortisol in our bloodstreams, which negatively impacts our whole bodies, which results in a physical manifestation of disease, higher rates of obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure.
Exposure to discrimination, either directly or indirectly, can trigger racial trauma, even vicariously, when they're not the target personally, but see themselves in that position. Media depictions of racism may also trigger feelings of racial trauma.
The reason that we can't watch it is because it could be our brother, our husbands, our uncles. It could be us.
And for Reverend Moss, it's like history repeating itself.
So, my friends, we must rise up. We also saw I saw my cousin who was lynched because they could not find the person they wanted to lynch without that spiritual dwelling. We've not been able to get through that.
And a lot of people fighting to be seen as who we are. And in that fight, in that struggle, comes stress and trauma.
In some cases, these prolonged incidents of racism and discrimination can lead to symptoms like those who battle post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD.
It's like the more racism you endure in your life, the more you have to put up with, the more traumatized you get, the more problems you have sleeping, the more problems you have trusting others, the more anxiety you have, the more fear you have.
Although Dr. Williams is working on a teaching manual that addresses working with racial trauma patients, she stresses there is a need for more people of color in the clinical professions, as well as more money for research.
I know what I'm talking about. I was there.
Reverend Moss says he still relies on his faith and the hope of a better day as we all try to understand and address the impact of racial trauma.
And never give up.
400 Years of Trauma is a production of Intentional Content, Inc. and part of the Connecting the Dots Between Race and Health, a project of IdeaStream Public Media, funded by the Dr. Donald J. Goodman and Ruth Weber Goodman Philanthropic Fund of the Cleveland Foundation.
One of the clients that I think about as it relates to this freeze response.
All right. All right, you guys can you're back to my slides?
Yes, yep, we are.
Okay, very good. So I'd like to share that video just to kind of give us more insight and awareness. Not that we're all not aware, but just to see it from a different angle as to the persistent nature of cultural trauma and the impact that it's having. So this evening, I'm going to talk about cultural trauma from a historical context, the consequences, and what it means to liberate ourselves from the impact of cultural trauma. So I need to make some adjustments here because I can't see my screen. Okay, and so I always start with a definition because I think it's important for us to really understand and have awareness of what we are up against as a community, as a people, and what that actually looks like. So when we talk about cultural trauma, we're really talking about an assault that is perpetuated by a dominant group of individuals based on their culture. This is done through force, threats of force, or oppressive policies with the purpose of damaging, devaluing, or destroying another culture to the advancement of the dominant group. And essentially what we're talking about is experiences of racism, experiences of discrimination, genocide, police brutality, mass incarceration. There's a laundry list of different experiences that we all have been either directly impacted by or have experienced or have seen it demonstrated throughout social media platforms. These forms of trauma are considered cultural trauma and are very specific to the cultural group that is impacted by it. So there are types of cultural trauma. Largely, these traumas focus more so on the psychological responses to a mass traumatic event that is shared by a group of individuals. We have historical trauma, which is multi-generational and is inflicted on a group of people with a shared identity and background. We have collective trauma, which is the psychological distress of a group of people experience in response to a shared trauma. And then we have interpersonal trauma, where it's culturally motivated physical violence towards members of a minority cultural group. So I'm going to talk about all three of these types of traumas as it relates to cultural trauma and what it looks like and how it shows up. So to start with our history, it's very important to understand where the symptoms start, where the symptoms originate. And I like to be very clear when I talk about history of trauma. We start with the Maafa, which is a key Swahili term that means terrible occurrence or great disaster. It is known as the Black Holocaust. A lot of times we refer to this as the period of enslavement. And when we talk about our history, it's important to identify that, or at least articulate that our history didn't start with the Maafa. The symptoms of trauma is where our history began as it relates to what we currently see in our communities and the impact of that. But our history started well before colonization in the period of enslavement. But because of the horrific nature of what took place during the Maafa, where our people were held captive, they were beaten, there was brutality, there was taken away from families, stripped from identities, a horrible, 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 and arguably the most horrific experience that a group of people experience. This is where the nature of a lot of psychological distress that we even see currently in our communities originated from. So we do like to start with that historical context because it puts into perspective how these things have shaped and influenced who we are as a people and how we decide to respond. It is important to also understand that even though there were amendments and things put into place and policies or laws that said slavery ended, we can also argue that even though physical slavery ended, and that's also arguable, bondage began and it continues. So what we're going to talk specifically about is the psychological damage and psychological bondage that is still alive and well today as a result of the Maafa. The chattel enslavement of Africans in the U.S. continues to serve as a source of traumatic stress for Black people today. And we see this through various forms of generational trauma and collective trauma. So we start, as as we attempt to understand the impact from the period of enslavement. But after slavery ended in its physical form, we moved into the Jim Crow era. And in the Jim Crow era, where white supremacy was pronounced and highlighted, the idea that white people were superior to those of other races, especially the Black race, and should therefore dominate society, was demonstrated throughout the country. There were lynchings, there were various forms of oppression, there was segregation. And the reason that it's important to understand what happened during enslavement, then as we moved into Jim Crow, is because, again, what we're attempting to understand is the psychological damage that was done. So when you think about enslavement and what that did to our ancestors, there were messaging that we continue to carry on throughout our experiences in current time. So the belief that Black folks are inferior, the belief that Black folks don't deserve the same rights and privileges, beliefs that Black folks don't have the same rights to access to care, these beliefs of inferiority are a result of what took place during enslavement and what happened during the Jim Crow era. Transmitting the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow moved us right into mass incarceration. Mass incarceration is another form of slavery. Black people make up about 12 to 13% of the country's population, but about 33% of the total prison population. Issues related to housing discrimination, police violence, redlining, mortgage foreclosures, and blockbusting, all of these experiences that most Black people throughout the country experience once or another, if not all of these things, these are considered experiences of collective and cultural trauma. Cultural displacement is another form where the process of a culture, either by physical separation from its roots or having the imposition of another culture eclipse and or replace that culture. So again, stripping individuals from who they are, from what they believed, from what they valued, from where they placed their highest value. Our culture was stripped from us and we were forced to adapt to and adhere to and to embrace a different culture that wasn't by design intended for us. And so when I get into what it means to be African-centered and how to address this from an African-centered perspective, I want you to hold that. The fact that a culture was stripped and we were separated from a culture that was naturally who we are and consistent with who we are, and forced to have a culture that was not meant for us, and the psychological implications of that. So traumatic stressors, we have direct traumatic stressors. These events impacts us in our way of living within a society of structural racism or being on the receiving end of individual racist acts. We have vicarious traumatic stressors, which are the indirect traumatic stressors that impacts our living with systemic racism and individual racist actions. For example, viewing videos of police beatings of our Black men and women, the video associated with the murder of George Floyd. Here in Ohio, there was the shooting of Jayland Walker by police, where they unloaded like 80 plus rounds on that young man. Tamir Rice was another case that happened here in Ohio. Watching these murders, watching what happened to our Black men, our Black women, our Black children, and how it's televised throughout different social media platforms. These things are traumatic. So it's not just traumatic to the people that it has happened to, but being on the receiving end of watching and navigating these experiences in different platforms also has a traumatic impact. It also carries the internalization message that we as Black people are inferior. So again, from enslavement, we believe that we were inferior and not of value without the same rights. That was reinforced during Jim Crow, is reinforced through mass incarceration. And now when we are seeing our Black men, women, and children being hurt, killed, lynched, and it's throughout social media platforms throughout the country. Again, even though we're dealing with the physical reactions, the psychological reactions are that, wow, we must be inferior. There must be something wrong with us. Because of why does these things continue to happen? Even when we think about what happened during COVID-19, the rate at which Black people contracted COVID and died, again, and then the messaging that came with that, psychologically, we are internalizing that we are inferior. There is something wrong with us as a people because we are the only race that continue to experience such persistent experiences of racism and other forms of oppression on a daily basis. When we talk about racism, we look at it at 4 different levels. We definitely want to understand it at the individual level, person against person. At the cultural level, which consists of the devaluation of a racial group's cultural practices or products. We need to understand it at the institutional level, where we see discriminatory laws and social policies. And then what I would call the most insidious and dangerous form is internalized racism, and that's self against self in our own group. And essentially what that means is that we have bought into the messages. We believe in the stereotypes. So we believe that we are not worthy. We believe that we are not human and don't have the same equal rights. We believe that we are inferior. And when we have that kind of belief system, then it turns into some of the responses or actions or the ways that we tend to cope. And internalized racism looks like community violence, Black on Black crime. It looks like domestic violence and abuse of our families and abuse of our children and abuse of our communities. So even though we like to point the finger and talk about, well, you know, racism doesn't exist, but there's a lot of Black on Black crime happening, or we're tearing up our own communities. No, that is also racism. It is a form of internalized racism for believing in the messages and the stereotypes that we have received from, again, hundreds and hundreds of years of how the government has been set up to make sure that Black folks in particular are disadvantaged. Racism and trauma. Again, the fatal shootings of numerous unarmed Black men, women, and children, what happened during the pandemic, and then hundreds of years of racism that have been perpetuated in multiple forms. We use social media platforms for education, to connect socially. Social media was a thing that probably got a lot of us through what happened during the pandemic when we had to distance ourselves from our families, our friends, and our social outings. But social media also plays a significant role in the impact of cultural trauma. So even though sometimes it could be well-intended that we are trying to educate each other or make sure that we are aware of the things that are happening in our communities and in our people, again, it's traumatizing to see. It's not that these things haven't happened since, you know, they said slavery ended, quote unquote, but now that it's being televised in a way on these different platforms of social media, that is doing more damage. It's doing more damage in terms of us internalizing the racism, and it's doing more damage in terms of vicarious trauma. So we have to be very careful in understanding how social media is also playing a role in cultural trauma. So the consequences, again, is what I refer to as internalized racism. The negative mental and behavioral health outcomes, where we experience a high rate of depression, powerlessness, domestic violence, abuse, low self-esteem. And again, it is really about the acceptance by the marginalized cultural group of the negative societal beliefs and stereotypes that have been shared and demonstrated and even reinforced in Black Americans. So the psychological distress that our people are experiencing is a result of cultural trauma. Our families being disjointed and broken apart is a consequence. Infant mortality, the rate that Black babies are dying. Infant mortality is a big thing in Ohio. There's an initiative to really bring awareness around the rate at which Black babies are dying. And this is something that is near and dear to me because I am aware by the research and personal experience that when Black babies are born, whether they're premature or they have low birth weight, in the hospitals, Black babies do better. White babies die at a higher rate in the hospital when they're born prematurely. But in the community, when Black babies are released to their homes, to their families, Black babies die at a higher rate than white babies. So again, when you think about, well, why, that doesn't even make sense. How does medically Black babies do better in hospitals? But when you think of the social, cultural, environmental factors, Black babies are dying at a higher rate. And most people say, well, what do you attribute that to? We attribute that to chronic stress, which is perpetuated by persistent racist actions, discrimination, discriminatory practices, and cultural trauma. The community violence rate, low self-efficacy, lack of motivation, again, various forms of abuse and addiction. All of these things stunts and or prevents the growth of the African-American community. So it again is by design. So understanding that these experiences that we are all having collectively, whether it's vicariously or directly, psychologically, if we're not careful, if we're not aware, if we're not educated, if we're not grounded or rooted in culturally specific strategies, then we are at risk of internalizing this racism that has, again, this list of consequences for our people. Attitudes and reactions we have that we inherited from slavery, again, it's been a generational process. So our attitudes about work, our attitudes about our personal inferiority, leadership, community division, family, property, and then our worldview, the type of worldview that we hold and how that's been socialized and shaped based on the experiences that we have. These are things that we inherit, like views about what kind of job we're going to have, if we are of value or have the same equal rights or opportunities, what kind of leaders we want to be, and etc. So all of these things, again, have been shaped psychologically from these, again, historical experiences of cultural trauma. So now that I've given you just a small little picture of what it is that we are dealing with, and again, what I tend to see in my clinic, whether I was at the Cleveland VA or I was at another community mental health agency, and even branching off and developing my own practice, what we see when people come into therapy or people are reaching out for resources and services and support, what we see are people really struggling with the impact that cultural trauma has had on them individually, collectively, in their communities, in their personal homes. So when we're talking about liberation, we want to talk about beginning with knowledge of self. Psychological liberation is needed to break the chains of psychological slavery. That is very important to understand as it relates to what do we do about it. So we talk a lot about what is happening to us and the impact that it has, but what is it that we need to do to make sure that we're not only surviving, but we are liberating ourselves from this kind of impact. So it begins with self-knowledge. And what does that mean? It means understanding who we are and where we come from, and that our history didn't start with slavery. it becomes very confusing when all we're talking about, especially what our young kids are learning about in school, their history is starting with slavery. We just think about the psychological impact of that. And kids will articulate that they are descendants of slaves. And that is not the truth. Our ancestors were enslaved. They were not slaves. And that's a very important difference that is important, you know, to understand, because again, what we're talking about is psychological liberation. So understanding that, no, your ancestors developed civilization, created science, math, medicine, and etc. before enslavement and colonization happened. So it's just messaging and information and education like that that is important to help us to understand who we are and where we come from. So we're not internalizing messaging that stems from enslavement, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, etc. So some protective factors. There are several studies that have talked about the protective nature of having an African-centered worldview and a belief system and value system. Resilience for African Americans specifically rests on the development of our racial identity and racial socialization. Knowledge of having African heritage and the promotion of our behaviors, thoughts, and emotions that foster the liberation of African Americans from oppression. So essentially what this talks about, and there are several studies that says that individuals who have a African-centered worldview, a view of the world that is rooted in ancient African history, meaning that there's a belief system that is held where highest value is placed on interpersonal relationships. There's highest value, and you understand yourself in connection to the creator. So there is a spiritual sense that we tend to understand our experiences through. Our relationships tend to be collective and communal. How we make decisions are more so from a diurnal perspective. We understand the both and take a holistic view of things versus a diurnal either or black and white kind of perspective. And then having harmony with nature and harmony with others. So these kind of values and concepts from an African-centered perspective have proven to protect people of African descent, specifically from experiences of racism and discrimination in terms of the psychological impact that it has. So what do? Sankofa is a Kan word from Ghana that means go back and fetch it. So just how we go back and we look at our history in terms of what has happened to us, we go back to our history and we fetch what was our ancestors doing to survive? What was our ancestors doing before all of this heinous, terrorist action took place? What did our ancestors do? Where did they place highest value? How did they cope? How did they make sense of the experiences? How did they liberate themselves? Sankofa represents the idea of looking back at our past to learn from it and move forward. So we do focus on the past. We look into our history, not just to understand the impact and what has happened to our people, but how do we go back and fix it? How do we survive it? How do we liberate ourselves from it? So one African-centered theory that I use, and this is the theory that I've been trained in, is what my dissertation was on, is what I practice, is what I study, is what I research. Optimal conceptual theory is an African-centered theoretical orientation that allows us to see the experiences that we have from an African perspective. So it's rooted in African and Black psychology. And essentially what that means is that we go back into our history and see what life was like prior to enslavement. What were our ancestors doing? How were they surviving? How were they advancing? How were they growing? How were they connecting? How were they communing? And then we figure out what that looks like, what happened to our people, the impact that that has, and get back to a way of life prior to all that trauma. This theory was developed specifically by Dr. Linda James Myers, who was at the Ohio State University. And essentially, what I like about this theory specifically is it captures the holistic experiences that people of African ancestry, African descent experience. So essentially, this theory talks about how various forms of oppression, so all of those isms, whether it's racism, sexism, classism, heterosexism, ageism, ableism, how all of these isms are assigned to who we are based on how we identify. And based on how we identify in the intersectionality of how we identify, we are afforded a certain level of privileges or advantages or not. And so based on how society is structured, we are all a part of these different categories that are assigned to us based on how we identify. We are either allowed certain access to things or certain rights to things, or just, fair and equitable treatment. So oppression in and of itself is a reason why we experience psychological distress at the rate that we experience it. Dr. Myers also talks about a suboptimal worldview. And what she means by a suboptimal worldview is we have bought into a worldview that wasn't designed for us, meaning we place highest value on materialism. We place value on individualism and competitiveness with nature and competitiveness with others. The way that we think about the world is segmented and disjointed. There is a separation between the physical and the spiritual realm. How we think about things and make sense is black and white from an either or perspective. That's called dichotomized thinking. So it's a worldview that we've all been socialized to believe in. And because it's not consistent with who we are naturally and is not innate in us or has been passed down from our ancestors, we're still striving to obtain these things. We're still trying to define ourselves by the amount of money, power, or material things that we have. This is considered a suboptimal worldview. When you think about money, power, and control, and we are trying to strive towards that, of course, we're going to see a higher rate of violence and crime and abuse and addiction and things of that nature. So according to Dr. Myers and OCT, she talks about various forms of oppression and having a suboptimal worldview, a worldview, again, that was forced onto our people after our ancestors were enslaved and stripped from their original worldview, that this is why we see so much distress in our communities. This model specifically considers the impact of generational, collective, and cultural trauma. So everything that we've talked about thus far in terms of the types of trauma that we are constantly experiencing, like this is why we're having these kinds of experiences. But this is the only model that I'm aware of in the literature that really allows us to process and think through and understand. So when clients come into the clinic, it's not about their thoughts, their feelings. It's not about their relationships with their parents. It is about all of those things, but it's about those things in the context of these historical injuries that have taken place. So even when you think about some of the theories that we learn about in our graduate programs or that we're, doing in our respective, internships, practicums, or in our clinics, these things are very important. CBT, important. Psychodynamic, important. Optimal conceptual theory and theories that are consistent with African Black psychology gives us permission to consider the cultural experiences, the lived experiences, and how some of these things, oppression and racism and cultural trauma, show up in these families, in these individuals, in our personal lives, because it does spill over in our work with people. This model emphasizes the importance of having an African-centered worldview and belief systems and values that gets back to how our ancestors were functioning, operating, and living prior to enslavement. So that's what OCT is about. So it's about understanding oppression, the various forms of it, how it's impacting us individually and collectively, understanding what kind of worldview we hold and how we've been socialized into a particular worldview and belief system that is inconsistent with who we are culturally. It allows us to really look at the impact of generational trauma and cultural trauma as we attempt to understand our experiences and then what we need to do about those experiences. And then it does emphasize the importance and the protective nature of having an African-centered worldview. So from that theory, Dr. Myers developed belief systems analysis, which is the psychotherapeutic approach derived specifically from optimal conceptual theory. So this therapeutic approach is considered cognitive-based and it is psychoeducational. So a couple things happened when individuals are engaging in this process. From a cognitive standpoint, there is a lot of exploration and examination of a person's worldview, their belief systems, their values, and their racial identity. So these concepts specifically, people have an opportunity to understand, like, okay, is my worldview a worldview that is something that is not consistent with who my people are and who I were intended to be? What kind of beliefs do I hold? Where am I placing my value? How do I feel about being Black and being Black in America? My racial identity. These things have a psychological impact. And because we tend to focus more on some of the reactions and the responses, like the violence or the addiction and the abuse that we often see in our communities, we get away from like the root cause. Like, why are these things continuing to happen? Why are these things persistent? Well, they're persistent because they're held on by a worldview and belief system that allows that kind of behavior and responses to continue. This therapeutic approach also examines the impact of those historical injuries. So how does, generational trauma show up? What are the patterns in each, families and generation that we now see in current day and time? What are the various forms of oppression? Are you experiencing sexism? Are you experiencing heterosexism? Are you experiencing ageism and racism? And what kind of psychological impact is that having? Again, oftentimes in most therapeutic approaches, we're focused on the behaviors and responses. But belief systems analysis allow us to really examine and explore what is holding and contributing to and maintaining these different responses. It is psychoeducational because we then begin to educate on the optimal versus the suboptimal worldview. So Dr. Myers talked about the optimal conceptual system, the optimal worldview being a worldview that is rooted in African-centered psychology, where emphasis again is placed on the spiritual understanding of self, a holistic worldview, understanding your knowledge of self based on where you come from and where you were intended to be, having a worth that is intrinsic, meaning because you are present in physical form, you have a divine purpose. The way that we identify is through our extended self. So we understand that we are bigger than our physical self. We understand that our ancestors, we understand that our higher power, we understand that the yet unborn, our community, our family, our loved ones we are responsible and have responsibility to all things and all people that allows us to make the best decisions and be able to engage in life in a way that is more collective. And again, the way that we tend to think from an African-centered perspective is diunital, it's both and. It's not either or, but two things can be true at the same time. Things can be both positive and negative at the same time. And if we bring balance to how we think and process information, it allows us to make better balanced decisions versus extreme decisions from an either or dichotomized way of thinking. So belief systems analysis is the therapeutic approach. It is not something that is time limited. In fact, it's process oriented. So it takes time. Again, we're talking about hundreds of years of psychological damage that people have an opportunity to begin to unpack and understand how this shows up for them. And then they can make a decision about how to begin to transform some of that by developing a higher level of consciousness just by educating ourselves on these experiences and pre and post enslavement, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, etc. So when we're talking about liberation, we're talking about understanding your worldview and your belief system. And again, from an African-centered perspective, that is what we're promoting, that is what we're referencing. African-centered is a worldview. It is not specific to Black people specifically. It is specific to a way of viewing the world and a way of viewing yourself in the world. African just means that everything, civilization, everything originated on the continent of Africa. What was life like before all of this trauma and chaos happened? And how do we get back to a worldview and belief system that is consistent with a holistic communal way of existing and being in the world? A value system. We talk a lot about the Nguzo Saba, those 7 basic values of African culture, which contribute to the building and reinforcing family, community, and culture among people of African descent. We usually celebrate Nguzo Saba during Kwanzaa, right? December 26th through January 1st, but those values were actually intended for us to celebrate every day and acknowledge every day, because again, it serves to protect us against the negative societal messages and the psychological damage that racism and discrimination is having on our people. Then a moral, ethical code and reasoning, the virtues of Mayat. Again, virtues of Mayat comes from ancient, again, Kemet, ancient Africa, where there was order. There was a way that we, again, strive towards being in the world that allowed us to be more spiritual, more collective, more connecting, more interpersonal, that again allow for more healthy and adaptive ways of living. Also, very important as it relates to how we begin to heal and liberate ourselves from the different forms of trauma is through racial socialization. So this is why even like, you know, we're here tonight, you guys have the speaker series, but Black student associations, Black art, like this is how we socialize ourselves into feeling good about being Black, about affirming who we are as Black people, affirming the Black experience. We have been socialized in a very racist context because those are the experiences that we have been having, unfortunately. So the reversal of that is to socialize ourselves racially and affirmly about who we are. So racial socialization, tons of research that talks about how this mitigates the impact of racism and cultural trauma. It serves as a protective factor against all the negative effects of racism and societal messages. It really helps our children and our adults to think more strategically about how to respond when we're confronted in these kind of situations. And it also promotes and instills a sense of cultural pride. So when we're talking about liberation, we're talking about, here's the thing, we learned a lot about how to feel bad about being Black and how negative it is to be Black. And that we have all of these, you know, experiences and disadvantages because we are Black. When you think about it from a very simplistic standpoint, the reversal of that as it relates to liberation is to do the opposite. Let's instill a sense of Black pride, a sense of cultural pride. Let's affirm each other. Let's unify. Let's build together. Let's create together. Let's come together and put things into place that is going to help uplift, liberate, and affirm our people, because we can't rely on the oppressors to do that. They are doing their job as intended, as been designed. But what we need to do as a people collectively is to come together to put real strategies and policies and laws and things in place that will begin to affirm and promote the advancement of Black people in particular. One final thing I want to talk about is the 5-Star Family Enhancement Plan. This plan was put together by Dr. Wade Nobles, who is an African Center scholar as well. And he put this together as we were going through the pandemic. And as we were going through the pandemic, now we're seeing, what happened with George Floyd that was televised and et cetera. And what he said is the 5-Star Family Enhancement Plan, and he called it Zola. Zola means love. And this allows us to activate our self-healing capacity, is remember who we are. That's that knowledge of self, remembering who we are, where we come from, who were our ancestors. Even our ancestors who were enslaved, how did they survive? What did they do? We know they did something great, because we wouldn't sit here and be able to have this conversation if they did not. So we must remember who we are. We have to remind ourselves that we live in a society and in a country where there's a lot of racism and oppression that is still happening. So we have to remind ourselves that that is still there. So we have to stay woke. We have to refrain from resulting in some of those maladaptive coping strategies, refrain from responding from a negative standpoint, right? The abuse, the violence, the addiction. We have to refrain by remembering who we are and who our ancestors were. We revitalize by coming together and putting things into place, coping, healing strategies, meditations, the things we need to do to stay healthy, coping, relying on the virtues of Maya, relying on Nguzusaba, relying on our worldview and knowledge of self to revitalize us from the trauma and the impact that that is having on us. And then we reward ourselves. We celebrate. We don't do enough celebrating each other. We don't do enough celebrating us. And just by doing these 5-Star Family Enhancement Plan, we will begin to see more connectivity, more unity, more healing, more affirming of the Black community, which again will allow us to begin to liberate ourselves from the impact of psychological slavery. So finally, what I want to say from a community standpoint, we must begin to reject slavery ideas individually and collectively. So those things that we learned from slavery, we need to start rejecting that. We are not inferior. We are worthy. We have the same rights and privileges to be here because we are here. We must make the commitment to engage in the personal and collective job of freeing ourselves from mental slavery. In order for us to do that, we first have to recognize that, in fact, that's what's happened to us. And the way that we think about things and the way that we respond without processing or understanding what we're responding to is a result of mental slavery. We must first acknowledge the impact of the slave mentality, know who we are, celebrate ourselves, have courage, begin to rely on unity and faith. And by doing these things at the community level and collectively, again, will allow us to liberate ourselves and be able to free ourselves from the chains of psychological slavery. So these are some readings that I encourage you to read if you're interested in learning more about Nana Linda's work and African Centered practice, understanding who we are and where we come from and the impact of slavery and how we still see these things today. I definitely encourage you to dive more into it. I talked very briefly because of the time that we have today, but we do full day trainings, half day trainings on belief systems analysis and OCT because that is available. We don't always learn about these in our graduate programs, but these approaches are available through the Association of Black Psychologists, where tons of theories and tons of healing approaches are available for our knowledge and awareness. And it's not just for us to know these things, but it's very important that we start to dive in and practice these things because our health and wellness depends on it. So with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and see what kind of questions or comments you all have.
So that was a word, and I felt like we should have had an all-day like seminar, not just a diversity speaker series. Such a plethora of good information that we really needed. So we're gonna open the floor. If any, I see somebody say yes, please, all-day seminar. Open the floor if anybody has any questions for Dr. Lodge.
This is not a question. This is a comment. Dr. Lodge, yeah, I agree. There was just not enough time for you to share all that we were hungry to hear, but what you shared was wonderful. I think just a session going back to teaching about Ma and the principles and Nguzo Saba, that could be the next step for those who are trying to increase their self-knowledge. So thank you so much for sharing what you did share.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
I was gonna say, Zeke, did you have a question?
well, more, maybe I can formulate a question, but I just wanted to highlight the importance. I'm very appreciative, and I hear what you said. We need to recontextualize or watch how we use the word slave and act like we're a descendant of a slave. I've often meditated on that as well. So I think that there needs to be, maybe the question would be, I guess, would it be, do you see the need then? But it seems like it's obvious that you do see the need, that we need to recontextualize how that history is taught. Because a lot of people, the way that it's taught, I think the trauma is being continued and proliferated because you have people who don't get knowledge of self, especially at a young age.
Absolutely.
And so I definitely know the impact of that, because I started to get my personal story a little bit. I was like the 3rd or 4th grade when I started to understand a more cultural based perspective on history and receiving truths that were not being taught in the school system. So I saw the difference. So anywho, I just wanted to give you a total thumbs up on that, loud and clear. I think it's very important work, and I appreciate your presentation.
Thank you.
You got it.
Well, I thank you all for your attention. And as I said, if you guys want copies of my slide, or if you want to hear more, I am a part of the training team that, again, does training for certification and continuing education on this topic specifically. So there's a lot, and it's a lot to unpack, but it's so necessary and much needed. So I just appreciate the time and space to be able to come and speak to you guys this evening.
And Dr. Lodge, just real quick, is that certification offered through your clinic, or is that offered through ABSI?
So it's offered through the Center for Optimal Thought, and it's actually Dr. Linda James Meyer's training facility. Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. You've given us a lot to think about, a lot to unpack. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to, seek you for certification and more information if that is something that we desire. I will let Nathan close us out as the president.
Yes, thank you. And I see tons of comments in the chat, everyone sharing their comments and appreciation for tonight. I'm definitely sure we'll be reaching back out. We appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge with us as well. On that note, we respect for everyone's time and close out here. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Lodge. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone. Thank you for being here.
Good evening.
Good night. Thank you. Great.